Hello, PCI. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you're all enjoying the conference. Really appreciate you coming this early in the morning to see our talk. And thank you also very much to the SEC for having us. So we are here to talk about what happens when a hacker comes knocking. So I've counseled a number of organizations that seemingly out of the blue are suddenly receiving a communication from somebody. It says, I found a vulnerability in your website or in your enterprise system, your product, and just want to talk. Found this vulnerability and I just want to talk. And people who are not prepared for that conversation can sometimes panic. And they can say, well, gosh, are we under attack? What should we do? What will PCI say about this? And so we're here to talk about all of those things.
Great.
So how do you deal with well-intentioned vulnerability disclosures? So I'm Harley Geiger, and I'm counsel at Venable LLP, where I focus on cybersecurity, incident management, and compliance. I also lead the Hacking Policy Council, which is a group of organizations that have expertise in vulnerability disclosure, bug bounties, penetration testing, and hacking law.
Great. Thanks so much, Harley. And I'm Ilona Cohen. I'm the Chief Legal and Policy Officer at HackerOne. We're an organization that helps companies like yours run vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty programs. My background is also in cyber. I was in the Obama White House as a lawyer handling all cyber incidents as well as cyber policy.
All right.
So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk to you about, as Harley mentioned, vulnerability disclosure policies as well as bug bounties, the process for receiving vulnerability disclosures from external sources such as hackers or security researchers. You can call them whatever you want. Those are essentially industry best practices now, and they're being built into regulations as mandatory for many different organizations. They're also being built into many different standards as mandatory. So we want to make sure that you have the best understanding of how to create one for yourselves, how to run it, what the difference between a VDP and a bug bounty is, and as Harley mentioned, what PCI DSS 4.0 says about it.
So we will also provide now a scientific review of hackers versus cyber criminals. So believe it or not, you cannot tell the difference by just whether they're wearing a hoodie. They're all wearing hoodies. I brought a hoodie here. We considered using it as a prop, but ditched that. So not all hackers are malicious actors. They're not all cyber criminals. There is a vibrant and valuable and very dramatic community out there of people who independently will test software to try to find vulnerabilities. And they're doing this not for malicious purposes, not for fraud, but in order to disclose those vulnerabilities so that then they can be patched before a malicious actor can exploit it and cause harm. So ultimately, this strengthens the ecosystem. That is really, they may have the same snarky attitude. That doesn't mean that they're out there trying to cause crimes. So treating those good faith security researchers as criminals can alienate them. It can backfire also on the organization. It can make it so that they still disclose the vulnerability, or it can cut off that valuable source of information for the organization, learning about those vulnerabilities, and cause bad press. I can tell you there's nothing that a lot of the community likes better than to say that they got shut down or ignored when they had a valuable contribution to make. Worse still is when law enforcement gets involved and there's an investigation and they find out that no, this person was not trying to commit a crime, they were trying to help. So 3 key signs, right? The hoodie's not it, the attitude's not it, and sometimes not even the permission, right? A lot of these folks will do it sort of independently, whether or not you've asked for it. 3 key signs. One is that the hacker is not asking for money in exchange for disclosing the vulnerability. And very clearly, they're not asking for money in exchange for not exploiting the vulnerability. That would be closer to extortion. Second is that if you have a designated channel for receiving disclosures about vulnerabilities or vulnerability disclosure policy, that they are following that channel. They're using that channel, they're following that policy. It's the second major sign. The third is that the hacker has not otherwise disrupted your system or exfiltrated more data than they need to prove the vulnerability.
So how do you start a vulnerability disclosure policy? What does your organization do in order to create one? I've met a lot of HackerOne's customers here at the conference. So if you have already created your HackerOne vulnerability disclosure policy, you're ahead of the game. But a VDP is essentially an official channel. It's worth noting the research is happening regardless of whether or not you have a VDP. This is just an official means by which you can accept it. So security researchers are out there looking at your systems no matter what. You want to make sure that you have a process to be able to accept that research, to actually look at that research, to analyze it, to determine whether or not it's valid, and then to be able to respond to it. So as important as actually creating the mechanism by which you accept the reports, like, you can have info at your company and you can accept those reports, but if you don't have the back end set up, you're not gonna have an effective VDP. So on the back end, what you need to do is be able to ultimately have the folks in place who will receive those, analyze those, determine the criticality, determine whether or not they need to be mitigated, and then manage them. And it's important to bring your legal and compliance teams in sort of at the beginning of this process, not at the end, because as those reports come in, you're going to want to make sure that you have an assessment of whether or not the vulnerability is effectively a breach, or whether or not it requires some other kind of reporting mechanism. So please make sure to bring in legal and compliance right from the start in order to have an effective VDP. So here are some tips, some basic tips to make sure that your vulnerability disclosure policy is successful. One, don't just set up the program and just sort of leave it unattended. You have to actively monitor your vulnerability disclosure policy and the vulnerabilities that you're getting in. If you do leave it unattended, then the good faith security researcher who reported it, they're not going to report that again, number one. And number two, instead of actually waiting for your response, they might go out and tweet the vulnerability that they ultimately discovered. The second one, as I mentioned, is make sure that you have a back-end process to actually handle it. As I mentioned, there's no value to these to the security researchers who ultimately are providing this information to you, except for potentially, credit that they ultimately notified the organization. And so you want to make sure that you have a whole back end to, one, identify the vulnerability, manage it, but then also have transparent communications with the hacker and give them an adequate timeline for when you're going to be able to respond to them, when you're going to be able to tell them that they can make their information, more widespread. And then, as I mentioned, make sure, and I don't just say this because I'm a lawyer, make sure to loop in legal and compliance. So here are just a couple of examples of VDPs that HackerOne has run. I think our most successful, frankly, is the Department of Defense. They just announced that they have received, since they started their program in 2016, 47,000 vulnerabilities that have been reported through the system. Now, I don't want to set expectations too high. If you set up a VDP, I do not think any organization is going to receive as many as that. But definitely, these are some of the successes that they've been able to accomplish through their VDP program.
And you'll see that a lot of regulations and standards increasingly require vulnerability disclosure policies, the NIST cybersecurity framework being one example. And and now all federal government agencies are required to have them. We're seeing them increasingly used at the state level as well. And you'll see that they bear a lot of commonalities, right? Such as a dedicated email address for receiving the vulnerability disclosures, as well as transparency about the timeline, like Ilona said. So a lot of these VDPs don't provide authorization for the security researcher upfront. But stating that whether or not there'll be a reward that is provided or whether or not there's authorization can help to set expectations. So what happens when the hacker does ask for money? So it's a red flag if they ask before disclosing the vulnerability. And it's definitely a red flag. It's a screaming red flag if they suggest that they will exploit the vulnerability or have somebody else exploit the vulnerability unless you pay them money. But that being said, it is not uncommon for security researchers that have disclosed a vulnerability to say, hey, can you buy me a cheeseburger? Can I have some kind of reward? I helped you out. Can you please help me out? For a lot of these folks, this is what they do for a living. However, that doesn't make it extortion, but the common industry advice is that if you have a vulnerability disclosure policy and you don't offer a reward up front, the common advice is not to pay, because then you set a precedent for future vulnerability disclosures that you'll be paying, sort of, and then you may have gray areas like, how significant is the vulnerability, how did the researcher act? So pay attention to the way that they ask for a reward if they do. More common is to give some swag, give a hoodie. The second thing to talk about when it comes to rewards is the credit. So for many security researchers, they want to talk about this process, the finding of the vulnerability, the disclosure in a public forum, often at an industry conference like DEF CON. And I've seen organizations before try to suppress this type of presentation, even after the vulnerability has been mitigated. However, this can often backfire. It usually ends up becoming part of the presentation, right? So I tried to disclose, they tried to shut me down, and I stood up in the name of security and disclosed anyway, and now I'm talking to you anyway. So the more successful way to do it is when the hacker wants to talk about their process and disclosing the vulnerability and getting it mitigated and making everyone more secure, is to use that story to turn it into a positive story. You, the organization, worked with the security community to identify a vulnerability, you mitigated it, and now everyone is more secure. This is the way that it's supposed to work, right? And it strengthens the ecosystem as a whole.
So let's talk for a minute about the differences. We talked to you about what a VDP is. Let's talk to you now about what a bug bounty is. And I promise you it does not involve any insects. VDP, as we mentioned, it's a basic standard practice. It's becoming more and more so for every technology in every sector. There's no payment. There's often no explicit authorization for the security researcher to come in and test your system. And it's usually organization-wide. Anything within your organization could be within the scope of the VDP. And it's not necessarily time-bound either. So receipt of these disclosures, it really could happen at any time. Contrast that with a bug bounty. So you've got, usually with a bug bounty, when you're incentivizing security researchers with a financial reward, you're going to get more of a response. That's at least been our experience at HackerOne. So it does involve a little bit more maturity. You have to make sure that you ultimately have the resources that are dedicated to responding to all of the different vulnerabilities that you're going to get. As we mentioned, payment is provided. And you are giving explicit authorization to the security researcher to test some aspect of your system. This can also be something that has no time binding, or it could be something that actually ultimately is like a specific focus in time. So we have, for example, challenges that at HackerOne that are a specific amount of time that hackers are invited into the system. We also have live hacking events, which are very popular, and that is, 2 days of intense hacking by some elite hackers, and the company will ask the hackers to provide any and as much information as they possibly can. So these two programs can vary pretty substantially, but even within bug bounty, there are a number of different ways you can set it up to be successful. So as we mentioned, here are some examples. I think the key here is to remember, you see here that some of these companies have paid out a sizable amount during their bug bounty programs, but the average cost, the average payout on our system for a vulnerability is about $1,000. And the average cost, by contrast, of a breach is about $4.5 million. So I think the cost-benefit analysis is pretty easy to determine.
This is the whole benefit of these types of programs, the vulnerability disclosure policies as well as bug bounties, right? I mean, ideally you are preventing breaches, which will cost your organization a great deal more. So how does this all fit in with PCI? So PCI DSS 4.0 does touch on vulnerability disclosure policies. So the A1.2.3 does require certain service providers to have a channel for customers to disclose vulnerabilities and cybersecurity incidents to them. So specifically multi-tenant service providers. So cloud service providers, web hosting companies, and things like that, SaaS companies. So these are required to have a means for customers to provide vulnerability information and incident notifications to them. And it also requires them to make sure that they have that crucial backend that we talked about, where you assess and manage the vulnerabilities that you've received. Now, this is a modified form of a vulnerability disclosure policy, right? It's not necessarily public-facing because it is focused on the customers being able to provide that information, but it is something that could potentially be achieved through a public-facing vulnerability disclosure policy. It's also worth noting that a couple of the other PCI standards also require vulnerability disclosure policies. So the mobile payment on COTS, or MPOC, as well as the 3DS Secure Software Development Kit, both of these have requirements for a public-facing vulnerability disclosure policy. So having a channel for unsolicited reports from the public, from customers, from independent investigators to submit vulnerabilities and to manage those. And that channel has to be secure. So just a security@company.com is not going to be adequate without additional encryption. I really have to press this thing. Oh no, okay. There we are. Okay, so PCI DSS also touches on bug bounties. So there is a requirement in PCI DSS 4.0 for the first time mentioning bug bounties in its guidance. So organizations are supposed to have a means of learning about vulnerabilities. So they are supposed to identify, manage vulnerabilities. And there's a control at 631 that encourages organizations to consider using bug bounties as a means of learning about new vulnerabilities. Organizations can fulfill this in a variety of ways as well, like threat intelligence. The guidance says bug bounties. It could also potentially be a vulnerability disclosure policy as a way of learning about new vulnerabilities. But as we talked about earlier, there are some differences between using the bug bounty route and the guidance and using a vulnerability disclosure policy. The VDPs are more likely to result in more sporadic and disclosures that have varying levels of significance. Once you have that disclosure, once you've received it, PCI has something to say about that as well. Your known system vulnerabilities have to be patched. If they're critical, then needs to be within 1 month. If it's not critical, then it's up to the entity, depending on your risk management system, with an example being around 3 months. In addition, you have to have an incident response plan where you are including a legal review of your breach notification and cyber incident reporting obligations. So, our takeaways. One, again, when a hacker does come knocking, it may not be to attack, right? Sometimes it is to help, and sometimes this can be a very positive thing for the organization. It can help prevent breaches and can even be a positive public story. Second, an important way of setting expectations up front, streamlining that sort of intake, that conversation, is having a vulnerability disclosure policy. Having a bug bounty program also can help organizations to proactively identify vulnerabilities and especially significant vulnerabilities and focus the scope in ways that benefit the organization the most. Fourth, both vulnerability disclosure policies and bug bounties can help organizations comply with not just PCI DSS 4.0, but also some of the other standards, MPOC and 3DS SDK.
So, we hope we've been able to persuade you to set up a VDP if you don't have one already. If you want to get started, here are some of the resources that you can ultimately turn to in order to try to start your own. As we mentioned, this is becoming increasingly commonplace, and the government itself, the US government, has mandated it for themselves since 2020. So as a result, they have a lot of resources on their websites, both on NIST as well as listed here, in order to be able to help you create your own VDP and what you need to be able to manage the different vulnerabilities. You've got the CERT guide, you've got specific EU references here, and of course, I couldn't leave without telling you, you can always find information at HackerOne.
All right. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful conference.